Last time that we were talking about things, we were talking about the forces that enabled imperialism. So the technologies that allow the Europeans to make their way into Africa. So we talked about the Maxim gun, made wars very defensive. Railroads allowed you to move stuff from the interior parts of Africa to the coastline, making the interior parts of Africa profitable. Also allowed you to move troops easily. Steamships allowed you to go upriver, and a cure for malaria allowed people to be immune to malaria, not to get sick, and then not to die from, getting a mosquito bite from a mosquito that had malaria. Okay, so you had all these European nations trying to get into the area, and that created a bit of a problem. And to make sure there weren't any problems, there's something called the Berlin Conference. Go ahead and make a bullet and write down Berlin Conference. So the Berlin Conference was 14 nations in Europe got together from 1884 to 1885, and they laid down some rules about how they were going to divide up Africa. So before 1884, not much of Africa is really controlled by Europeans, just the coastline, really. And everything else is controlled by Africans, so the interior parts away from the coastline. But in 1884, they wanted to lay down some rules because, you had King Leopold of Belgium, and he was already kind of in the area. And so they wanted to establish some rules about, well, how do we make sure that we don't end up getting into wars with each other as we're trying to divide up Africa? And that's what the Berlin Conference is about. You would think maybe there would be Africans invited to the conference to talk about, like, hey, maybe we should have a say because we live here. Europeans were like, no, you don't get a say at all. So yeah, no Africans were there. The only people that were there were European nations and the United States. So the United States was the only non-European nation that was at the Berlin Conference. Gonna make a one, and we're gonna write down 14 European nations met at the Berlin Conference, 1884 to 1885. So number one, 14 European nations met at the Berlin Conference, 1884 to 1885. So the Berlin Conference there, as I said, they were just establishing rules about how to divide up Africa. The United States, we were there. We don't end up picking up any colonies in Africa. There is Liberia, which is an independent nation in Africa that was established by freed slaves from the United States. But besides Liberia, which we do recognize as a nation, we don't have any colonies in the area. We do have economic interest, and we were trading a lot in the area, but we don't end up taking over any territory for ourselves. But we were at the Berlin Conference helping lay down some rules because we were doing work, I believe, with Belgium and Germany at this time period in Africa. So we wanted to make sure our interests in the area were kept secure. So that's why we were at the conference. Okay. Now, the Berlin Conference didn't settle all the problems. There were some problems that end up happening eventually. So we said that part of the reason that they were doing the Berlin Conference was to keep wars from happening between the European nations. And, well, that didn't exactly all happen. There was one war kind of between some Europeans, and that's called the Boer War. Go ahead and make a bullet and write down Boer War. Now, this isn't a boar as in a pig boar. This boar is actually a word in Dutch. So it doesn't add, so it's not, it's not a feral pig or anything. Right? So it's not a boar. Instead, a boar, it's a Dutch word and it means farmer. We're going to make a one and write down boars = Dutch for farmers. So one, boar = Dutch for farmers. So Boers, they're Dutch farmers. So Boer with the ER at the end is an AR. That's just a Dutch farmer. And these Dutch farmers were living in the south part of Africa, and they were just farming the area. So they're living in the very southern part of Africa. So see right here on the little map there, you see on there, bam, right down the very southern tip of Africa. That's where they were living at. And since they'd been living there, they had been kind of farming the land and such. However, what ends up happening is while the Boers were living in southern Africa, They end up discovering some diamonds and gold there. Go ahead and make a 2. Diamonds and gold were discovered in South Africa or Southern Africa. So 2, diamonds and gold were discovered in Southern Africa. So diamonds and gold were discovered in Southern Africa. And the British, even though they weren't living the area at that current point in time, were like, oh, sweet. Free diamonds and gold. We just got to take it from the Boers. So they end up getting into a conflict with the Boers over the gold and diamonds. So diamonds and gold were in the area. The British decided they wanted it, and the Boers didn't want to give up the lands that they had taken over from the Africans. So this leads to the Boer War. And in the Boer War, how it kind of goes is the British were kind of moving into the area. They were fighting against the Boers. They weren't able to really defeat the Boers because the Boers were pretty good at engaging them and then moving away and engaging them and moving away. So using guerrilla tactics, like we talked about before, which is when you hit the enemy and then move away. And that's kind of what the Boers were doing as well. So they were doing a lot of good work in guerrilla style. And the British came up with a strategy. They're like, all right, so we can't really fight them in one big battle because they won't fight us in one big battle. And they're constantly doing damage to us. So we need some way to get them to stop fighting against us. And the solution that they came up with was to, whenever they took over Boer territory, they would burn down the homes of the Boers. So you see this in the picture in the bottom right of a home being burned here by the British. So they were burning down the homes of the British, and then they were capturing any women or children, because men were the ones who were fighting against the British, and they were obviously with their other soldiers and so forth. So then they capture any women and children they found, and then chucked them into a concentration camp. Not as bad as a concentration camp as in like World War II Germany, but still a concentration camp nonetheless. Go ahead and make a 3. And we're going to write down British countered by burning Boer farms. There you go. British burned down Boer farms. That works a bit better. So that's number 3. So 3 British burned down Boer farms. So they burn down Boer farms. And the other thing we talked about was, and this is going to be 4 women and children in disease-ridden concentration camps. So that kind of picture of the concentration camp I showed you, which I'll show you again in a bit. That's where they threw women and children at. And because, you have a bunch of people living in close proximity to one another, diseases, viruses can spread very quickly in a very tight area. So then disease and viruses are kind of wipe out some concentration camps populations. So with all these tactics together, burning down the Boer farms, which the reason why they're burning down the Boer farms was to give the Boers no place to go back to. So these Dutch farmers would have no place to go back to because the farmers completely burned down. And by taking away their wives and children and put them in concentration camps, that way they were like, hey, want to see them again? Give up. So eventually, after 3 years of fighting, the Dutch Boers, they eventually gave up, and the British end up taking over control of the area. Well, at least for 8 more years. And then in 1910, South Africa declares independence from the British. Number 5. Britain won the war in 1902. 5. Britain won the war in 1902. So I said they defeat the Boers in 1902. 8 years later, the government of South Africa, which is run pretty much by the British and the Boers, then declare independence from Britain and make their own nation in 1910. All right, so next thing we're going to talk about is the impact of colonial rule. I'm going to make a new bullet, impact of colonial rule. So new bullet, impact of colonial rule. So what was the impact of Europeans going into Africa and taking over territory? So this isn't like during the slave trade era in which they were taking people out of the area and sending them to Americas, which kind of hurt the population of Africa by taking away a chunk of the population and the skilled workers that they had. This is the Europeans now taking over the area and basically doing a lot of forced labor on the Africans living in the area and such. Let's start with the positives first. Number one, schools and hospitals. So there weren't a lot of schools and hospitals in Africa before Europeans' arrival. Once the Europeans arrived, the number of schools in the area and hospitals did increase. So when hospitals were in the area, of course, that causes lifespans to increase and such. Schools in the area cause literacy rates to improve. That's going to be number two. So number two, literacy rates improved. So if you say that someone's literate, that means they can read. So if you're literate, that means you can read, which is most of the population that lives in the United States. It's like 99%, of the population can read, which is most first world countries being like, United States, Canada, Europe. Those are like first world countries, Japan. So first world countries, it's mainly 99%. And then kind of as you go down from there, like second world countries, that'd be like the Russia, and people at kind of like that level would be then lower literacy rates. And then your third world countries are places where they're pretty poor countries and so forth. And the number of people that can read there is like, 50% and so forth. So being able to read is important for your economic growth. Number three, telephone/telegraph lines. So telephone, you guys all know what a telephone is. At this time period, telephones would have had been wired to one another. And a telegraph is just when it's like the thing that goes beep, 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 Morse code. That's a telegraph. So we had telegraphs, a beep, beep, beep thing that you would send messages to other people kind of across. And then eventually the telegraphs were kind of replaced by telephones that allowed someone just to talk across the line. Number four, Africans lose control of land. So obviously a negative of Europeans coming to the area was the Europeans taking over control of the lands away from the Africans. There were new diseases that did come into the area. However, since the area is very tropical, Africa is very tropical, Europeans aren't very used to a tropical environment. So Europeans would get pretty sick from malaria and such. So there were new diseases introduced to the area, but more the tropical diseases affected the Europeans more. Number five, famine caused by cash crops over subsistence. Or subsistence, I should say. What does that mean? That means that we were tearing down food crops in exchange for, hey, you guys should grow some rubber trees. So we're tear up all these plants that grow you food and then put rubber trees in. Then the people end up starving to death, and then you don't have workers. So that was a big problem. It was a focus of things that made big amounts of money instead of thinking about, hey, we need to be able to feed these people. And six, break down traditional African cultures. What does that mean? That means that Europeans were coming into the area and the culture of the Europeans was getting into Africa and replacing some of the traditional African cultures. So we talked about traditional West African religion before, about how each job has certain magical properties. That kind of belief in traditional West African religion, it still goes on till nowadays, but it starts to weaken when Europeans start to come in the area. All right, let's go ahead and stop our notes there for today.